Case number 1 is that of Harold Shipman. In the early 1990s, within the quiet surgery rooms of Hyde, England, Dr. Harold Shipman began a methodical campaign of murder that would eventually be recognized as the most prolific in modern history. Shipman was not a surgeon working in the shadows. He was a trusted general practitioner who used his professional authority to walk into the homes of his patients and end their lives. The betrayal was total. He utilized the very tools of his trade, the syringe and the medical bag, to facilitate an unprecedented spree of clinical executions under the guise of routine healthcare. The incident followed a chillingly consistent pattern. Shipman typically targeted elderly women who lived alone, visiting them in the afternoons when they were most vulnerable. On the pretext of administering a flu jab or a painkiller, he would inject them with lethal doses of diamorphine. He would then sit in their living rooms, often watching as they slipped from consciousness into death in their favorite armchairs. Once the life had left them, he would leave the premises, only to discover the body later or wait for a relative to call him. He then exercised his ultimate power. He would sign the death certificate himself, attributing the passing to natural causes or old age, effectively bypassing any need for an autopsy or police intervention. The moral irony of Shipman's crimes was his ability to play the role of the grieving, supportive physician to the families he had just orphaned. For years, he was his own forensic shield. However, the turn came in June 1998, following the death of 81-year-old Kathleen Grundy. Shipman had visited her that morning. By noon, she was dead. His fatal miscalculation was not the murder itself, but his attempt to profit from it. He forged a will that left Kathleen's entire £386,000 estate to him, rather than her children. When Kathleen's daughter, a solicitor, saw the poorly typed, error-ridden document, she knew her mother could never have written it. The investigation that followed utilized pioneering digital forensics to dismantle Shipman's facade. Detectives seized his surgery computer and discovered that he had been backdating medical records. He had created fake histories of heart disease and respiratory failure for patients who were actually in perfect health until the day he killed them. He was literally writing the script for their deaths in the system after they were already dead. When police finally exhumed several of his victims, including Kathleen Grundy, the toxicology reports told the truth. They were filled with lethal levels of morphine. In January 2000, Harold Shipman was convicted of 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery, receiving 15 life sentences. However, the subsequent Shipman inquiry concluded that his true victim count was at least 215, with many investigators believing the real number exceeded 250. He took his own life in his prison cell in 2004, never expressing a word of remorse for the hundreds of lives he extinguished. He remains the ultimate personification of the predator in a white coat, a man who transformed a place of healing into a hunting ground. Case number 2 is that of Frederick Petier. Between 2008 and 2017, the operating theaters of 2 private clinics in Besançon, France, became the site of a calculated and repetitive crime committed by star anesthesiologist Dr. Frederick Petier. Unlike many medical criminals who seek to end life, Petier's objective was to manufacture life-threatening crises so that he could intervene and demonstrate his superior medical prowess. The betrayal was one of extreme professional vanity. He intentionally poisoned patients to create the very emergencies he was trained to prevent, turning routine surgeries into scenes of cardiac chaos. The incident involved a pattern of medical sabotage where Petier would secretly contaminate the 4 bags used by his colleagues. Using his unrestricted access to the clinic's supply rooms, he injected lethal amounts of potassium chloride and local anesthetics into bags of saline. These bags were then administered to patients undergoing minor, low-risk procedures. As the poisoned fluid entered their systems, healthy patients would suddenly and inexplicably go into cardiac arrest. Petier would then happen to be nearby, rushing into the room to lead the resuscitation efforts. He was effectively the arsonist playing the role of the hero, using human bodies as the stage for his self-aggrandizing performances. The moral weight of this case is found in the terror of the survivors and the deaths of those Petier failed to save. For those who did not survive the cardiac events, Their deaths were initially written off as rare surgical complications. This allowed Petier to continue his spree for nearly a decade, feeding his ego on the adrenaline of the operating room and the praise of shaken surgeons who were grateful for his timely interventions. The turn occurred in January 2017, following a routine spinal operation on a 36-year-old woman. When she suffered a sudden heart attack, the medical team grew suspicious. A subsequent analysis of the 4-bag revealed potassium levels more than 100 times higher than normal. This was the slip-up that triggered a massive police inquiry. Investigators began looking at hundreds of adverse events at the clinics and found that Petier was the only common denominator. Digital logs showed he was frequently present in the clinics during his time off, often appearing near the anesthesia carts just before an emergency occurred. The arrest of Petier sent shockwaves through the French medical community. Prosecutors eventually linked him to 30 cases of poisoning, 12 of which were fatal. In late 2025, Frédéric Petier was sentenced to life imprisonment. The court determined that his actions were motivated by a desire to settle scores with rival doctors by making their surgeries fail, combined with a pathological need for professional admiration. He remains a chilling example of a healer who weaponized the very medicine meant to sustain life to satisfy a deadly craving for glory. Case number 3 is that of Nigel Cox. On August 16, 1991, within the Royal Hampshire County Hospital in Winchester, England, Dr. Nigel Cox performed a lethal injection that would ignite a global debate on the boundaries of medical ethics. Cox, a respected rheumatologist, had been treating 70-year-old Lillian Boy for over 13 years, witnessing her body's total disintegration due to severe rheumatoid arthritis. The incident was not a clandestine act of malice, but a deliberate decision made in the open, recorded by the doctor himself in the patient's official medical logs. Lillian Boy's final days were characterized by a level of physical suffering that traditional medicine could no longer mitigate. She weighed barely 90 pounds. Her skin was covered in weeping ulcers, and her joints were so damaged that her bones audibly grated together when she was moved. Despite receiving massive doses of morphine and heroin, she remained in agony, pleading for the end. Dr. Cox, reaching the limit of his emotional and professional endurance, decided to grant her request. He moved from the role of a healer to that of an executioner, a transition that constituted a profound legal and moral betrayal of his medical oath. The crime involved the administration of 2 ampoules of undiluted potassium chloride. Unlike the narcotics previously used to dull Lillian's pain, potassium chloride has no analgesic properties. Its only function in high doses is to stop the heart instantly by disrupting the electrical signals required for cardiac contraction. Dr. Cox injected the substance into Lillian's arm, and she died minutes later. He did not attempt to hide the act, believing it was a justifiable mercy. He signed the hospital logs, detailing the exact substance and dosage used, effectively creating a permanent record of his violation of the law. The turn in the case occurred when a nurse, reviewing the patient's records, recognized the potassium chloride entry as a lethal deviation from standard palliative care. Because Lillian had been cremated shortly after her death, the physical evidence was gone, but the documentation remained. Dr. Cox was arrested and charged with attempted murder, as the prosecution could prove his intent to kill through his own written testimony, even if they could no longer prove the exact cause of death via autopsy. The legal proceedings in 1992 became a landmark in the history of mercy killings. While the jury found him guilty, the court struggled with the irony of a doctor who killed out of a desperate, misplaced sense of compassion for a long-term patient. Dr. Cox was given a 12-month suspended sentence and was eventually allowed to return to medical practice under supervision. The case remains a stark reminder that even a motive of empathy cannot legally authorize a physician to cross the unspoken line between relieving pain and intentionally ending a life. Case number 4 is that of Reynaldo Rivera Ortiz Jr. In the summer of 2022, the Baylor Scott & White Surgicare North Dallas facility became the site of a series of inexplicable and terrifying medical emergencies. Dr. Reynaldo Ortiz, an anesthesiologist with a history of disciplinary issues and a volatile temperament, transformed the surgical center into a hunting ground by weaponizing the very fluids intended to keep patients stable. The betrayal was rooted in a calculated act of professional sabotage. Ortiz was not attempting to heal or even to mercifully end lives, but rather to retaliate against the facility for a series of medical board investigations into his past conduct. The incident involved a sophisticated and deadly method of tampering with 4 bags. Ortiz began injecting lethal cocktails of nerve-blocking agents, such as bupivacaine and lidocaine, into saline bags that were kept in the center's warming bins. These contaminated bags were then used indiscriminately by other physicians during routine surgeries. For the patients, the effect was immediate and catastrophic. People in for simple procedures like sinus surgeries or cosmetic work suddenly suffered massive, unexplainable cardiac events. Among the victims was Ortiz's own colleague, Dr. Melanie Casper, who died after taking one of the poison bags home to treat her own dehydration. The moral weight of the case centers on Ortiz's cold detachment. He did not directly administer the fatal doses. Instead, he left them like traps for his unsuspecting coworkers to trigger. He watched from the hallways as ambulances arrived to transport the victims of his handiwork, maintaining a facade of professional concern while secretly orchestrating the chaos. The betrayal was twofold. He violated the safety of his patients and the professional trust of his colleagues, using human lives as pawns in a petty vendetta against the administration. The turn occurred in August 2022, after an 18-year-old patient suffered a sudden, near-fatal cardiac arrest during a routine procedure. Doctors noted a small puncture hole in the 4-bag wrapper and realized the fluid had been tampered with. This discovery prompted a review of the facility's internal surveillance footage. The cameras told a damning story. Time and again, Dr. Ortiz was captured taking 4 bags to the warming bins, looking over his shoulder, and swapping them out just before they were pulled for use in the operating rooms. The arrest and subsequent investigation linked Ortiz to at least 11 mysterious cardiac events over a 3-month period. Digital forensics and the physical evidence of the puncture marks provided the final pieces of the puzzle. In April 2024, a jury convicted him on multiple counts of tampering with consumer products and drug adulteration. In November 2024, Reynaldo Rivera Ortiz Jr. was sentenced to 190 years in federal prison. The case stands as a harrowing example of how a doctor's personal grievances can lead to a calculated and cold-blooded campaign of medical terror. Case number 5 is that of suing Lisa Tsang. In the suburban landscape of Rowland Heights, California, Dr. Suing Tsang operated a clinic that became a primary engine for the burgeoning opioid crisis. Known to her patients as Dr. Lisa, she didn't provide healthcare so much as she facilitated a high-volume narcotics distribution center. The betrayal in this case was systemic and predatory. Tsang exploited her medical license to operate a pill mill, trading the lives of young addicts for a staggering financial windfall. She ignored the fundamental medical duty to protect patients from harm, choosing instead to become a legal drug dealer who ignored the mounting body count at her doorstep. The incident was not a single event, but a sustained pattern of lethal overprescription. Tsang was notorious for prescribing the Holy Trinity, a deadly combination of opioids, benzodiazepines, and muscle relaxants, to patients who showed no medical need for the drugs. She frequently saw dozens of patients a day, spending mere minutes with each before handing over prescriptions for high-dose OxyContin and Xanax. The irony was that while she wore the white coat of a physician, her clinic operated like a back-alley transaction hub, complete with lines of young people stretching out the door, many of whom traveled hundreds of miles to receive her signatures. The moral weight of Tsang's actions was punctuated by her reaction to the consequences of her prescriptions. Between 2007 and 2010, at least 12 of her patients died from overdoses. Investigators found that the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, and various pharmacies had notified her repeatedly that her patients were dying or were doctor shopping for narcotics. Tsang's response was not to stop, but to double down, even writing prescriptions for patients after she had been informed they had already died from an overdose of the drugs she provided. She viewed the deaths not as tragedies, but as inconveniences to her lucrative business model. The turn occurred through an undercover operation led by the DEA and the California Medical Board. Agents posing as patients were able to obtain prescriptions for powerful narcotics within minutes, often without any physical examination or verification of medical history. The digital forensics was equally damning. Investigators recovered thousands of emails and medical files showing that Sang had fabricated patient charts after the fact to make it appear as though she had performed legitimate medical checkups. She was manufacturing a paper trail of care to hide a reality of cold-blooded profit-seeking. In 2015, suing Sang made legal history by becoming the first doctor in the United States to be convicted of second-degree murder for the overprescription of drugs. The prosecution focused on the deaths of three young men, Joey Rivero, Stephen Ogle, and Voon Nguyen. In early 2016, she was sentenced to 30 years to life in prison. Her case remains a definitive example of medical betrayal, where a physician's greed was allowed to override every ethical safeguard, resulting in a trail of preventable deaths that shattered families across the state. Case number 6 is that of Jack Kevorkian. In the late 20th century, the American medical landscape was fundamentally shaken by the actions of Dr. Jack Kevorkian, a pathologist who earned the macabre moniker Dr. Death. Kevorkian did not operate in secret. He sought the brightest spotlight to challenge the legal and moral prohibitions against physician-assisted suicide. The betrayal in Kevorkian's case is a matter of intense philosophical debate. He was accused of betraying the fundamental medical oath to do no harm by actively terminating lives, while he argued that the ultimate betrayal was forcing terminally ill patients to endure agonizing, prolonged deaths. The incident that defined Kevorkian's career was the development and use of his Mercitron and Thanatron machines. These devices were designed to allow patients to self-administer lethal doses of chemicals or carbon monoxide. Between 1990 and 1998, Kevorkian assisted in the deaths of approximately 130 individuals. The irony of his practice was that as a pathologist, a doctor who studies the dead, he had spent his career away from living patients. Yet he became the most sought-after medical figure for those looking to end their lives. He operated out of the back of a rusty 1968 Volkswagen van, transforming a common vehicle into a mobile site for state line crossing executions. The moral weight of Kevorkian's work shifted dramatically on September 17, 1998. Until that point, Kevorkian had always ensured the patient triggered the final mechanism of death. However, with 52-year-old Thomas Yuk, who suffered from advanced ALS, Kevorkian took a step that the law could not ignore. Because Yuk was physically unable to initiate the process, Kevorkian personally injected the lethal drugs into his arm. In an act of staggering defiance, Kevorkian videotaped the procedure and provided the footage to the news program 60 Minutes. He wanted a legal showdown, believing he could force a change in the law by showing the world a mercy killing in high definition. The turn in the case was the direct result of this broadcast. By personally administering the injection, Kevorkian had crossed the line from assisted suicide to active euthanasia, which is legally classified as homicide. The prosecution used the very footage Kevorkian had provided as the primary evidence of his crime. During his 1999 trial, Kevorkian chose to represent himself, a decision that proved to be a fatal miscalculation. He lacked the legal nuance to navigate the charges, and his courtroom antics did little to sway the jury against the clear evidence of his actions. In 1999, Jack Kevorkian was convicted of second-degree murder and delivery of a controlled substance. He was sentenced to 10 to 25 years in prison. Although he was released on parole in 2007 for good behavior and failing health, his conviction remained a definitive legal statement on the role of the physician. Kevorkian's legacy is one of absolute polarization. To some, he was a courageous advocate for patient autonomy. To others, he was a dangerous zealot who betrayed the sanctity of his profession by turning the doctor's hand into a weapon of death.